Hey everyone, Danielle here with our week 5 video in the Getting Started series, and this week we're going to be talking about inks. When I first started stamping, I was a little bit confused because there are a lot of different types of inks out there. Not only different brands and manufacturers, but actual types of inks with different purposes. And it took me a while to figure out which each kind was used for. So that's what I'm hoping to achieve with this video, is to clear up any confusion you might have when you're stamping. The first type of ink we're going to talk about are called dye inks, and now you can get them in any variety of colors, and black and brown and whatever, but if you're looking for a really good black ink, especially for stamping a sentiment or if you're paper piecing, I highly recommend this VersaFine Onyx Black. This is my go-to black. I use this 99% of the time. If you see black on my card, this is probably what I'm using. I've used a lot of other black inks, and I will never use another one again. This is my absolute favorite. I always get a nice, clean, crisp stamp when I use this. There's no blotchiness or splotchiness, and it's just, I don't know, it's pretty much the perfect black ink in my opinion. I know other people use other things, but if you haven't tried this, I really suggest that you do. And I know you think, oh, black ink, what's the big deal? But this is life-changing, really, it is. So that's my favorite black dye ink for stamping sentiments. The nice thing about dye inks are that they dry really fast, so they're not going to smudge or smear like some of the others. The only downside is you do want to use them on a lighter colored paper because of the consistency of the ink. It's almost a little bit translucent, so you're not going to get, it's not going to show up real well if you use it on dark cardstock, unless of course you're looking for a tone-on-tone effect. And a little tip is you might want to store these upside down so that the dye stays close to the surface of the ink pad. Second type of black dye ink that I use, the other 1% of the time, is the Memento Tuxedo Black. And the only time I use this ink is if I'm coloring with my Copics or watercolors, or if I'm going to be getting my stamped image wet for whatever reason, because it's not going to smear. VersaFine will kind of smear or bleed if you get it wet, even if it is dry. I've let it sit overnight and then colored with it and it still smears a little bit. But this Memento Tuxedo Black will never smear. I do not use it when I do my regular stamping, especially if I'm stamping a sentiment or a big solid image, because I find that it turns up really blotchy. And I don't know if it's just me, I don't know if it's the ink, I don't know what, but this is my personal preference. Whenever I try and stamp, just regularly stamp with it, I don't get a good result. But I do know that some people use this as their go-to black, and that's fine. And if you want to try them both, be my guest, because it's obviously whatever works best for you. But for whatever reason, I really have trouble stamping with this regularly, which is silly. So those are my two black inks that I highly recommend. And like I said, dye inks come in pretty much any other color you can imagine as well. And you can buy the Memento and the VersaFine in colored. I never have, because I have two companies that I always go to when I buy my dye inks. And the first is Hero Arts, and they have a whole line of really beautiful shadow inks. And they come in soft shadows, and now they have this new mid-tone line, which I'm absolutely loving. This is the bubblegum color. I'm not one for pink, but I do really like this. And the beauty of these dye inks is that you always get a nice smooth stamp with it. With some dye inks that I've used, it's really hard. I stamp with it and it's kind of blotchy. I guess that's just the nature of a dye ink. But Hero Arts has really mastered this, and when you stamp with it, it'll turn out just beautifully. So I'm going to go ahead and show you really quick what's going to happen when you stamp with this. With a lot of dye inks, when you ink your stamp up and stamp it first, it is going to look a little splotchy or uneven. And with other companies, if you try it, it's going to dry splotchy and uneven. But for whatever reason, whatever Hero Arts did, they really figured this out. So you're going to stamp with it, and it might look a little splotchy and uneven at first, but I'm going to show you a little sample that I've stamped weeks and weeks and weeks ago. When it dries, it's going to dry perfectly smooth. It like evens out, and it's just beautiful. Now when you first stamp it, it's going to be a little bit darker than what you're expecting, but when it dries, as you can see here on the right, it dries a little bit lighter, more true to the color that you're expecting. And as you can see here, there's a bunch of colors. These are actually just a handful that I happen to have right now. And by the way, if you're looking for a good gray, definitely get wet cement. This is the best gray. I've tried a million, and this is finally the color and shade of gray that I was looking for. But anyway, so that's the Hero Arts shadow inks. And like I said, they're going to dry a little splotchy, but they will even out. The second type of dye ink I use is distress inks. And I really don't think distress inks were designed for stamping big images or getting a nice kind of clean stamp with. They are called distress inks, so when you use them, you're going to get more of a distressed look, obviously. And so I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to take the same stamp, ink it up, and do the same thing. And when I stamp it with this, you'll see that it's already kind of beading up onto the stamp. And then when I stamp with it, that's going to kind of result in an uneven stamp and a little bit of splotchiness. And that's how it's going to dry. Whereas Hero Arts, when you first stamp it, it's a little bit, blotchy, but it will smooth out. With the distress inks, it's going to stay that way. It's not going to change at all. And that's just the nature of the ink. It's designed to look like that. It's not because it's bad ink. It's because that's how it was designed to be, give it that distressed look. And I'm actually going to do a second video and show you a bunch of different things that you can do with distress inks, because quite honestly, I never really use them just for stamping. I actually use them for a lot of other things. There's a million different techniques you can use with your distress inks to really kind of step up your stamping. So these are the two, the Hero Arts Shadow Inks and the Distress Inks by Ranger Industries. And those are my two go-to dye inks for when I'm looking for a color. Like I said before, the black I use the VersaFine and the Memento. But with colors, I always do Hero Arts or distress inks. The next type of ink I'm going to show you is a pigment ink, and these are a lot different than your dye inks. Your pigment inks are pretty much like opaque, and this is the only pigment ink I own is white. And I do use it fairly often. It's just I'm not a big fan of the colored pigment inks, but some people love them. That's up to you. But a pigment ink is going to be really thick, and the only way I can think of to describe it is like juicy almost. When you ink up your stamp, you're going to see the ink on there. And I'm going to go ahead and show you. I'm going to take the same stamp that I used with the dye inks, and I'm going to ink it up with this pigment ink. And it's my fault, I never flipped the stamp over to show you, but it's almost as if you dipped your stamp into like an acrylic paint. It's very thick. And when you stamp with it, I find that you're not going to get as crisp of an image as you do when you use a dye ink, just because there's so much ink on your stamp. And hopefully you can see even around the kind of the edge of each of those little petals, in some places where there was a lot of ink, it kind of pooled. And so it takes a really long time to dry. So as you can see, I just rubbed my finger on it and it's pretty wet. And even if you let it sit overnight, it might still be wet in the morning. So definitely something you might want to actually use your heat gun to heat set it to dry it a little bit faster. It is good to have on hand, especially white. It's nice to use on a darker cardstock, but like I said, it's personal preference. I don't really use pigment inks for anything besides stamping with that white. Next is a chalk ink, and to be honest, I don't really know how to describe it other than it's somewhere between a pigment ink and a dye ink for me. Like, that's how I would describe it. You're going to get a little bit more of an opaque color like you do with a pigment ink, but it's kind of like the consistency of a dye ink. And the only downside is when you use these, it's beautiful, vibrant colors, it stamps wonderfully, except it will stain your stamps, and it will stain them forever, I'm pretty sure at least. I've tried to clean these a lot, and it's always been red. Now, it doesn't impact your stamping later on. Once you clean the stamp, even though it still looks red, it's not going to stamp red. So unless you're that concerned about the color of your stamps, I would recommend at least giving chalk inks a try. Next up is watermark ink, and this is the only one I've ever seen and used, and it's called Versamark, and it's kind of neat. It's like almost like a glue pad. It's a tacky ink, I'll say, and you can use it for embossing with your embossing powders, or you can even use it by itself to get a really neat tone-on-tone look. So I'm going to go ahead and show you on a piece of craft cardstock. I'm going to get this little stamp from Studio Calico, and I'm going to ink it up with the Versamark. Just ignore that big black splotch on the ink pad. Your ink pad won't come like that. That's just me being silly and stamping with a with something with black ink on it. But I'm just going to ink up the little camera and stamp it on this craft, and you can see when it comes off that you get this really neat kind of tone-on-tone look. And it's super subtle, so it's nice just to add a little something to your card. It's not not going to make a bold statement. And like I said, you can use it with your embossing powders. That's kind of what it's intended to do. But another neat neat ink to have on hand. And the last type is a solvent ink. And these, just like this package says, it says for every surface, and it really is for every surface, and it really does stay on forever. You can stamp on paper, like regular paper, like you would. You can stamp on specialty paper, like the clear cardstock and the vellum I showed you back like in the first week. And you can also stamp on pretty much anything else you want to stamp on. Glass, plastic, fabric. It's really neat for stamping on fabric. You can make t-shirts or bags or towels or pretty much whatever you wanted, and you could color them in, and then you can throw it actually in the wash and it will come out and look just the same as it did before you put it in. The only downside with StazOn is it does smell, has a really distinct smell, and it dries up pretty fast. It actually comes with this plastic cover on it that says do not discard, and you don't want to throw it away like I did with my white one, because it helps to keep your ink pad from drying up as quickly. So that's the StazOn. And I'm just really quickly going to show you, here's the one I stamped before. It was a little bit darker, and as you can see, as it dries smooth, and it's starting to lighten up to be true to color. And here's the distress ink I stamped with, and it's dry as well, but like I said before, it's still splotchy. I'm going to make a second video showing you just a handful of things that you can do with the distress inks, because like I said, I don't really use them for regular stamping. I actually use them and do a couple different techniques, and I definitely recommend trying distress inks. I don't know how people live without distress inks. I really don't. I use it on almost every card I make. So if you've never tried it, I definitely recommend it. I definitely at least recommend watching the second video to see some of the fun things that you can do with it. And if you have any questions, as usual, let me know. And if not, I will see you next week, and I hope you all have a good weekend. Thanks for watching.